Welcome. I'm Dean Forbes, and over my shoulder is a photo of my late limited colleague Francis Ian Andersen. For 50 years, we worked on the database that I'm about to describe. One of the interesting things to me, anyway, is how complementary our skills and interests turned out to be. He, the holder of a degree in Russian, a degree in physical chemistry, and of course all sorts of biblical studies degrees, and I, person who was a research scientist at Hewlett-Packard Laboratories with lots of mathematics in my background, but I did take Hebrew. I did study in Israel a year, so that we were able to talk about these topics, even though we would defer to each other when we were deciding about issues in one or the other's particular domain. Our approaches were complementary in that also that when we happened on a situation in the data and the grammar, in the text that we couldn't make sense of, Frank's tendency was to say, well, there's something going on here. This isn't just a happenstance. So he saw signal. And my tendency was to say, this doesn't make sense. Maybe this is noise. And so the tension between those two perspectives was very useful as we would argue through things. Another thing that was a complementary difference was that when it came to building taxonomies and defining categories, Frank was a splitter, I am a quitter. What does it mean? It means that if you have a category, Frank was very happy to split it 2 or 3 ways, a little more nuance in each of the offspring of the original category. My tendency was to say, can we combine these things? There's a way to get rid of them so that we don't have so many categories for us to deal with and people to learn about. My final comment is, or second to the final, is that Frank did all of the parsing, basically. The computer parsed the phrase structure and got about 85% of it correct, and he went the last 15%. But the computer wasn't nearly so good with the higher level parts of the hierarchy, the grammatical hierarchy, and so Frank was a fellow who dealt with those. And he was remarkably consistent. I did a study once published about what the degree of consistency. And it was 99.9 sort of a percent thing we're talking about. We're still looking for errors always, and we're still trying to make things more consistent, and that will continue. But basically, it's Frank Andersen's parsing of the Hebrew Bible. Final comment, some parts of this presentation I've repeated myself. In some places I have misspoken slightly in obvious sorts of ways. I hope you will tolerate that and enjoy it and benefit from it. Onward and upward. Thank you. In my presentation today, I will discuss the Andersen-Forbes approach to biblical Hebrew as it pertains to the Andersen-Forbes database, taking up the characteristics of the text that we have analyzed and the division of that text. I will then take up our approach to grammar, a data-driven approach, as you will see, and how it pertains specifically to our organization of parts of speech. Finally, I will take up how we went about visualizing the text, the grammatical characteristics of the text of the Hebrew Bible. The structures that we used, the resulting hierarchy of constituents, the nature of clause immediate constituents and phrases, and certain attributes of words that make for use for very interesting discoveries when one searches. The material taken up in this talk is almost all the material is covered in a book that Eisenbrown published in 2012 by Andersen-Forbes, Biblical Hebrew Grammar Visualized. The chapters of the book pretty much are organized along the lines of this presentation. And when in various cases where more detail might be sought, appendices have been supplied. So let's get started and take up first the topic of the biblical Hebrew texts that are at the base of the Andersen-Forbes database. Fairly early on, we decided to use the text of the Leningrad Codex,
although I recall G.E. Weil trying to convince us at one point that we should replace the L Pentateuch with what was found in British Museum OR 4445. We did not do so. We did restore the Joshua 21 verses as is typically done. When there was a debate as to what the text likely was, we would consult the Makor facsimile edition of L, badly printed, unfortunately. Often that consultation was inconclusive. Obvious errors were corrected because we couldn't afford to have too many aberrant forms, computers being very primitive when we started out in 1970. We consulted Dotan, and we consulted BHS later on. Indeed, the changes we made are documented in the Biblical Hebrew Grammar Visualized volume. Our omission of cantillations, we've been reproached at times for having done so. In our defense, we have to say that in 1970, input was achieved through a teletype, and teletypes did not have lowercase letters, so we were restricted in the symbol set that we could use. And early on, we decided that since our interests were primarily in the grammar, and because Frank had serious reservations about the reliability of many of the cantillations, we decided to omit them. They could be added even to this day, and probably without too much effort were that desired. Frank had a thing about emendations. He was not, neither he nor David Noel Friedman were of a mind happily to amend right and left. They were good friends with Dowd, who had a tendency in the other direction. But Frank resisted them, although he admitted that many times they made very good sense and were very defensible. But we, to this day, have not included them. And in many ways, it's made things simpler for us. As for the handling of lexical and structural ambiguity, we early on had to decide that we couldn't let things get out of hand. And so Frank resolutely decided how to resolve the various instances of ambiguity. As it happens, ambiguity has always been one of my interests, and in formulating the representation that we use in the database, provisions have been made for representing ambiguity, even though the combinatorics of the situation are such that once you allow ambiguity into the tent, things get out of hand very quickly indeed. A topic of much debate early on was what to do with carrés and catives. And Frank, who was had the final word in these matters in those days, decreed that we would parse the cative texts using the pointings suggested by Gordis in his volume. We have the carrés in there, and indeed it's a matter of a Sitzfleisch, basically, to represent the carré text and have it toggleable, so you could either do one or the other or both. But we have not done that. Other interests have instead taken precedence. Our basic units of analysis we term segments rather than words. Others refer to them as words. They're of three sorts. Whole words, Dawid, for example, free morphemes. Parts of words, such as prefixes and suffixes, Birushalayim, where B is the bound morpheme, counts as a segment. And ligatured words, say Beth El, where the two taken together, a lexicalized phrase, are treated as a single segment. In addition to defining where the segment's boundaries occur, another very important task is to define the boundaries of clauses. We do this algorithmically. This has been published, and it's also in the Biblical Hebrew Grammar book. using clause onset rules, empirical clause onset rules, followed by expert correction. Whenever you see expert in this presentation, that is a euphemism for Francis Andersen. That leads to some issues, but I think that for an initial pass anyway, was the best way to handle things. So let us now turn to the issues that are involved in propounding a grammar for Biblical Hebrew. From the beginning, we have sought to build on traditional Biblical Hebrew grammar. We've extended beyond it only when required by the data of the Masoretic text. As is the tradition of Biblical Hebrew grammars, we early on focused on the received text, that is, the surface structure of the texts, and not include deep structure in our deliberations. We have adopted a constituency or phrase structure perspective. That is, bigger grammatical units are built up by assembling together smaller grammatical units. Rather than subscribing to a single school of modern linguistics, we have adopted the insights of various schools eclectically when driven to do so by the observed data. On the more technical side of things, we followed the school of generalized phrase structure grammar when they realized that a great deal of phrase structure in languages could be recovered using fairly simple grammars called context-free grammars. We've published a fair amount in this area. From the outset of our collaboration, we shared an interest in discourse analysis, perhaps a result of Frank's work on his sentence book. In any case, our first joint presentation was before the Pacific Coast section of the SBL, perhaps in 1971, and dealt with discourse analysis and its future. We're only about 50 years out of premature on that. There's a chapter in the grammar book on discourse analysis and what our approach to it has been, will be. Our starting point of focusing on surface structure and not concerning ourselves with any reconstructed deep structure had implications when it came time to represent phenomena such as ellipsis. We did not resort to null nodes, that is zeros, but we represented the situation nonetheless, as you become clear, after we've introduced the structures that we use to visualize the grammar. Early on, we had to decide how to treat the building up of constituents. For example, when one had coordination, an instance of coordination, how did one go about representing the noun phrase, let's say, that resulted from the coordination of a bunch of nouns? If we had A and B, the orthodoxy of transformationalism was that all of the nodes that we had in our representation, all of the places where things were gathered together, the gathering had to occur in pairs. We decided, and there was grounds in certain of the grammars that were extant at the time, that we would allow in-array representation, that is to say, allow more than two constituents to be joined together at any given time, so that A and B was joined, all three items were joined together at one time rather than having A and as one subconstituent and then B as the other constituent. Under the doctrine of the autonomy of syntax, the orthodoxy at the time we were putting things together was that one should use only syntactic information in order to build up representational structures. When we tried to do this computationally, we found we got good results in building up phrase-level kinds of structures, but not good, very bad results, in fact, when higher-level items were being dealt with, such as the declaration that something was a subject and something else was an object. We found, however, that when we put in very simple semantic information, the parsers, the computational parsers, became much more clever. And so we, in fact, used semantic information. I realize that since I have yet to introduce the actual representational structures that we used, this particular bullet point is hard to explain and therefore hard to understand. But what it amounts to is that we found that when the computer, and especially when the human overreader, was dealing with a text, it was crucial not only to use an analysis that proceeded from words up through phrases to more complicated phrases, but also to look at what was going on in nearby clauses, adjacent clauses in the text. Transformational orthodoxy held that constituents could not be discontinuous. That is to say, they could not have seemingly extraneous materials interpolated into their midst. But we early on found that this just didn't seem to work for Hebrew, and so we had to permit discontinuity. That created lots of headaches and should have resulted in many an impasse being encountered, but in fact it proved a very useful and defensible way to proceed. Examples will be given below. As for the second part of this bullet, multiple parents, let's put this in brackets if you don't mind. You'll see an example of multiple parents on down the way. And finally, we allowed for the existence in biblical Hebrew of free phrase order phenomena. Now, this is not to say that we assert that biblical Hebrew is a free word order language, to use the old way of putting the proposition, but rather we allow it to exhibit free phrase order phenomena. And if these never occur, then we will have empirically been able to infer that Hebrew is in fact a fixed word, or better, phrase order language. This slide augments the predecessor slide with the emboldened bracketed items to the right in each of the bullets. These refer to the various orthodoxies, linguistic orthodoxies, that have been transgressed by the choices that we have made. This is not something that the average user needs to take cognizance of particularly. If you happen to be interested in them, they are covered in the Biblical Hebrew Grammar Visualized book. Otherwise, they're basically by way of indicating where we have departed from various of the orthodoxies. This slide documents some of the generalities that apply to our part of speech taxonomy. Most of the items involve either reassigning members of one category to some other category, or subdividing a traditional category into various subclasses. In terms of the hierarchy top level, for example, we reclassify 5 traditional adverbs into a new class called quasi-verbals. There are 5 such quasi-verbals. They include items such as yesh and ein. And then, for example, distinguishing open interrogatives from closed interrogatives. Closed interrogatives are yes-no interrogatives. Open interrogatives are, as the name implies, it's an open set, includes things like who, what, when, where, why, how. At the lower levels of the part of speech hierarchy, taxonomy, we subdivide various classes to allow more refined searches. For example, the noun is divided into 8 subdivisions such as proper noun, ethnic, and so on. The finite verbs are divided into 10 subclasses such as insistent imperative, suffix sequentials. And then a major subdivision that hasn't been done in the literature before, so far as I am aware, involves subdividing the participles into 4 subclasses. Those that are purely nominal, those that are purely verbal, and then a subset that involves participles that exhibit noun-verb behavior. Reading from right to left, they behave like nouns, and reading from left to right, they behave like verbs. We'll give an example actually in the last of the graphs that we show, the trees that we show at the end of this presentation. And finally, a quick comment about part-of-speech features. Our parts of speech have characteristics, features that are marked, such as the traditional number, gender, person, state sort of thing. But then in addition, substantives have semantic tags that are fairly detailed, such as appliance, building, creature, deity. This once again allows for more refined searches. So how do we actually visualize the grammatical structure of the clauses making up the Masoretic text? We turn to that topic now, get into the hierarchy of constituents that result, the clause immediate constituents that are central to our analysis of various kinds, and then quickly we touch on phrases, and finally on attributes that are associated with segments or quote words, and how they are very useful in various kinds of searches. Throughout, we'll sprinkle a few so-called phrase markers, a term you will become used to in just a minute, that show actual clauses and how we handle their various behaviors. So our constituent analysis is communicated primarily through tree diagrams called phrase markers, abbreviated PMs. This is a commonplace of many linguistic theories, and it's perhaps easier to show what a tree diagram is, a phrase marker, than describe it in the abstract. But basically, we put the trees on their sides with the trunk, the root, on the far left, and the leaves, the segments that make up the clause or the constituent being analyzed, to the far right. As it happens, however, certain linguistic phenomena, which occur in Biblical Hebrew, require more powerful structures, namely graphs. For the casual user, the distinction between a tree and a graph is not all that important, probably. But we'll show you some examples in just a few minutes so you get the idea of what is a tree and what is a graph. Our phrase markers portray both the ordering of constituents and the hierarchy of the constituents within the clauses. I'll point this out in just a few moments as we take up a phrase marker. The phrase markers involve labeled nodes and directed connecting edges, arrows. That is how the information is encoded. As you'll see in a few minutes, the node labels reveal the functions and forms of the constituents, as well as the grammatical principles that license their formation. If we consider the clause to be the linchpin of our analyses, then higher in the hierarchy than the clause, the items are called, at present, supraclausal entities. In point of fact, eventually, these supraclausal entities will be made specific as we form the discourse units that make up the discourse and give them their appropriate labels. But for now, we just call them supraclausal. The main or matrix clauses of our analysis are our prime focus, and we do distinguish between clauses and sentences, as you will see. A major constituent of our analysis is the clause immediate constituent. Immediate constituent just means that it is the so-called daughter of the clausal mother node. The significance of these final two assertions on this slide will be made clear as we take up the specifics of the following phrase marker for Genesis 3:21. So here we have the phrase marker for Genesis 3:21, showing the 5 levels of the hierarchy of major constituents, beginning with the supraclausal items here, which have as their daughters the clausal items, which consists in this case of 2 clauses, this clause and this clause, joined by an and the daughters of the clausal items are the clause immediate constituents, this level here. When these have daughters that are themselves constituents that involve more than one segment, we are in the domain of the phrases here. And then, of course, the segments, the leaves of this tree, are here at the far side, the right side of the item. And then finally, the glosses are here. The type glosses. What do we mean by the type glosses? That means that something like Ya'as will always be glossed he made, independent of what the local context for the one particular token of this item might be. And similarly, with a suffix like O, we do not say that it's his woman, we say his him. And if the occasion required, we could modify the gloss, obviously, and fix it so that when it was a suffix like this, it would be his woman, and when it was lo, to him, it would be to him rather than to his him. The phrase markers have built into them the precedence relations and the dominance relations that exists in the text that is here displayed. The precedence relations are just that this precedes this, and similarly down here, this precedes this, and so on. And the dominance relations are, for example, that this node dominates these segments, and this node dominates that one. So this is mother-daughter here, and mother-daughter, 5 different daughters here. Now if you imagine this as a tree lying on its side with a root here over on the far left, and the leaves, these segments are the leaves, they're termed leaves in graph theory, tree theory if you will. So we have here here's the root, and it's the mother node to these other nodes, and in this case there are 3 daughters, not 2. We're not constrained to a binary split. This has 3. Then this item here, which is a clause, CLS, and this item here, which is a clause, the DSCRS in discourse. This clause here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 offspring, and down here this clause here has only 2. Clause immediate constituents. These are the immediate constituents of the clause node. Okay? And then these clause immediate constituents often have phrasal offspring. This particular one has as its offspring a noun phrase. This says the semantics of the noun is deity, and that this noun phrase has 2 pieces, and they have been assembled by apposition. Adonai and Elohim go together to form a single noun phrase having semantics of deity by apposition. And then if you come down here, la Adam, you have a prepositional phrase, to, and then a noun with human or substantive, with human semantics assembled on the basis of the behaviors that prepositions have. Whereas down here you have ishto assembled into a noun phrase with human semantics on the using the licensing relation suffixation, and then this has as its parent this prepositional phrase node, which puts the le together with the ishto to form this prepositional phrase to human. And then this la'adam and this la'ishto is coordinated. They are coordinated together to form this phrase here, which has three daughters, la'adam, hu, la'ishto, to Adam and to his woman. So that's another phrase. Down here we have a phrase which is assembled, has two elements, two constituents, and is assembled to form a noun. These two go together to form a noun phrase with semantics of outfit, and they are assembled on the basis of construct, a construct relation, tunics of skin. Okay. There are a few other behaviors to notice. For example, at the far left, the supraclausal nodes, the edges that join the daughters of this node to it, these arrows, are dashed. Well, why is that? That indicates that the structures that are involved here are not final structures. There's more work to be done. The discourse has to be assembled. Relationships of coherence have to be specified, and so on and so forth, in discourse units. So we are building a discourse unit. And at this point, we have a sentence which consists of this clause and this clause. So that's why the dashes are here. Don't freak out over the dash stuff. In fact, there's a way in the setup of this display to hide these nodes that are only joined to the rest by the dashed lines. Okay. Next, let's take a look at these traffic lights along the top here. In the case of the supraclausal level, the top level, as it were, of the hierarchy, it is red. This indicates that the analysis here is very incomplete, is going to change, certainly, and not to get hung up on them. In fact, there's a way to, on the setup for the display, there's a way to turn off these, make it so these things are hidden. But notice that the clause at the clause level of the hierarchy, we've put a green light. These are likely only to change when errors are discovered. There are going to be some errors, but the bottom line is these are trustworthy. This level is trustworthy. And then skipping across the clause immediate constituents, the kicks, we come to the phrases. The phrases were assembled computationally. The computer got about 85% of them correct, and then the human overreader, Frank, corrected the rest. And most of the correction involved dealing with cases where there was discontinuity and multi-dominance. We'll get to that later in a later phrase marker. The segments are stable by now. We very rarely find errors. In fact, I think it's been years. The glosses I've marked with green. There's talk sometimes of maybe improving and refining them. Sometimes if a gloss is just totally off of the mark, it's an indication that we've got a homograph, and we have to resolve a lexeme, split a lexeme to overcome that, and then gloss the pieces accordingly. But nowadays we rarely detect that. But nonetheless, for example, it would be fairly simple to fix things so that when the suffix is a suffix on a noun like this, we would say his, and then in another context say him, and so on. So some improvements could be made, but it's not a high priority at all. I consider it basically involving settled areas. Now, if we look at the kick column, the clause immediate constituent column here, we see that it is headed by a stoplight that is a mixture of green and yellow. Why is that? Well, it turns out that the labels on the clause immediate constituents are complete when we are talking about the traditional complements in the clause, such as the subject, the direct object, indirect object, what have you. There's a list in the program that you can consult if you're so inclined. But some items have not been filled in. Now, when the kick, when the kick daughter is what I call a substantive focused item, and that includes noun phrases and prepositional phrases, then that item has both a grammatical function to be specified, like in this case, subject, and a semantic role to be specified, in this case, agent. Or consider this prepositional, union prepositional phrase down here to Adam and to his woman. It's an indirect object, and it involves a beneficiary. And then finally down here, this item, the tunic of skin, is a direct object, and the semantic role is patient, which is a traditional role for this, a thing that is acted upon. So, Adonai Elohim did something, namely, he made a tunic of skin for Adam and his woman, and all of that has been filled in. But it turns out, we'll see in a couple minutes, that there are cases where the items haven't all been filled in. But suffice it to say, if it's a grammatical, the grammatical function is filled in if we're talking about a traditional complement. And if we're not involved with a traditional complement, then the semantic role has been filled in. As I say, we'll see in a little bit what's going on there. There is one further item that needs to be talked about in the kick column, specifically this conjunction that is clause initial, which is labeled as a discourse-ready sequential wa. In the next slide, we'll explain what discourse-ready is all about. Basically, though, to give you a first try at it, these are constituents that syntactically really are not part of the clause that they are next to, but we've parked them here against the day when we do the discourse analysis, at which time they will be popped out and become so-called cue phrases, that is to say, indicators of the connectivity of the discourse. The next slide will be more specific. The next 5 slides deal with the different kinds of clause-immediate constituents that we encounter. The first such set are referred to as interim discourse kicks, and consist of the discourse items that we just talked about that are joined to their offspring with dashed arrows, dashed edges. And then the discourse-ready constituents are a different animal. They are not syntactically attached to the clauses, but we park them. That is to say, we show them as connected to the clause nodes, even though when a proper discourse analysis is carried through, we expect that many, if not most, of them will be integrated into the structure of the discourse at the discourse level. These include discourse and, or discourse w, discourse sequential w, and something called syntactic isolates. And by the way, here's a good point, a good place in the presentation to remark that the database includes a glossary of our terminology. And if you should one day happen upon a term like syntactic isolate and you haven't a clue as to what that's all about, go to the glossary and it will give you a definition, which is linked to other definitions in the glossary. That can be quite helpful. Anyway, the syntactic isolates include such items as exclamative, vocative, header or label, and something we call exocentric absolute. We take up exocentric absolute in the next slide, where we, perhaps a little prematurely, show a phrase marker holding where an exocentric absolute is represented. Here we show a clause with 5 kicks attached to the clause node, the mother node. And the final such kick is the subject, big king. And this subject is an agent. He does something, namely he came, as we go up and look at the brown item, which is the predicator, the finite verb, he came. So the big king came, And then at the very beginning, we have something called a discourse-ready exocentric absolute. Now, the little city in the min in her, the little min in her, a few min in her, comes first. In many handlings of Hebrew grammar, this would be, grammar in general, this would be referred to as an instance of left dislocation. But we have avoided that term because when you say something is dislocated, that implies that you know where it came from, that it has some sort of canonical position in a clause, and that this has been overtaken by moving this thing up to the very beginning of the clause. Since we don't want to assume that things have a natural position, we're happy if the data show that to be the case, but we don't want to presuppose that, we've adopted instead the terminology exocentric absolute. It's less concrete than dislocation, but it leaves options open. So we see we have two discourse-ready items, kicks, at the beginning, the exocentric absolute, and then a discourse-ready and. In addition to the interim classes of kick-immediate constituents that we just covered in the previous slide, a further kind of clause-immediate constituent is defined by three kick classes that do not take semantic roles. Or put it a different way, they involve neither noun phrases nor prepositional phrases. They are of three kinds. The predicator, that's the verb, forms the nucleus of the clause, operators, and aspectualizers. And there are details here, 9 different kinds of predicators, 6 different kinds of operators, like not, and so on, and 5 subclasses of aspectualizer. This clause from 2 Sam 1943 shows examples of each. The first kick in the clause is ha, yes, no, interrogative. And you can see that it's labeled as an operator and that it's a closed interrogative. Okay. The second one is an intensifying aspectualizer, ahol. The third is the predicator, a finite verb in this case. And then the final item is a prepositional phrase, but it's been assigned a semantic role. It's movement beginning. It's what it says here, from the king. But the item up above, the grammatical function of this, has not been filled in, and so there's a double underbar there, which tells us that the item is awaiting category assignment. Now, that is a process that's actively underway, and in the subsequent release, sort of the midterm release of the database, we hope to have all of these filled in and checked. That's a fairly tall order given the ebbs and flows of these days, but that's our goal in any case. So next we come to the clause-immediate constituents for which it makes sense to define semantic roles. That is to say, those kicks that involve substantives, be they free or in the body of prepositional phrases. Each such kick has a grammatical function, which we abbreviate GF, and a semantic role SR. In this slide, we characterize the grammatical functions associated with such kicks. Traditionally, the grammatical functions for kicks that can have semantic roles are divided into 2 subsets. The complement set, or in terms of role and reference grammar, the logical core, and the adjuncts, which role and reference grammar refers to as the logical periphery. Now, the complements, it is traditionally said that the complement completes the action specified by a verb. But of course, not all verbs specify an action. So what's going on there? And furthermore, it is said that they are in some sense obligatory, except when they aren't. And there's a lot of toing and froing about all this. The other set are referred to as adjuncts, see the bottom of the slide, or logical periphery. They are supposedly optional and are part of and are logically peripheral. By logically peripheral, we mean that in terms of the logic of the situation, they are peripheral, but in terms of position, they might not be so at all. This is the way that Roland reference grammar allows one to envision languages that cater to free phrase order. Now, when one looks at what's included among the complements, we see some old friends such as the subject, the objects, and so on and so forth. But some new items are there too, and I don't think in this presentation we can get into all of that. It is taken up in the book, and I suspect we'll need to have some more chats about all this. Let me just say, for one thing, when you see all of this richness, there's no need to freak out when you see, for example, Janus subject. Traditional subject, okay, you know all about that. But what's a Janus subject? It turns out that a Janus subject is a subject that is only necessitated because of the existence of three-part verbless clauses. And we're not going to get into all of that here, but Frank Andersen, at his death, was working on a book that dealt with the verbless clause, his very mature final conclusions on all of that. And he had basically got the book finished, and we're now trying to get ready for publication. The first 4 lines of this slide duplicate what was said in the previous slide. What differs is that we're now taking up the specification of semantic roles. We've divided the classes of semantic roles into 7 subclasses. There, in fact, however, are altogether at present 57 different kinds of semantic roles. It's very much an open set, I think we have to confess. And this is where Frank's interest in splitting and my interest in quitting very much came to the fore. The final comment there about a problem that long was beyond us, we have solved, and I put here a quote by Wunderlich. The concept of semantic role becomes less interesting for stative verbs, which lack dynamic identification of roles, and it breaks down with symmetric verbs, which by definition allow each argument in each position. The why and the how of all of this has to do with the handling of verbless clauses and be verbs, haya, and quasi-verbal, and even comes up to some extent in finite verbs which have subject and object complements. Can't get into all of that here. Suffice it to say that we have not yet implemented our solution, but that is something that also is very much on our agenda. We distinguish basic phrases from complex phrases. Basic phrases involving only one licensing relation, and complex phrases involving more than one. I'm not going to go through all of this. I think it's time to get back to some phrase markers where things get less abstract and perhaps more concrete and hence more intelligible. But suffice it to say, please, that we recognize several different kinds of basic phrases, and this slide gives you the examples of the basic phrases. As you can see, the combinatorics of the situation gets slightly out of hand when we turn to complex phrases. By the way, these are handled or discussed and examples shown in chapter 6 of the grammar book. I'm not going to go through all of this once again, but you can see that the complex phrases are many and quite varied. This slide shows the handling by Andersen-Forbes and by Homestead of 1 Samuel 8:2. This verse is very interesting in that in our representation we utilize discontinuity and multiple parents to handle the behaviors in the clause. Let's see how things are similar and how they differ. We have a discourse-ready sequential and, which is this and here, obviously. And then we have a finite verb, yahi, and then a subject which consists, which is built up. Here's a noun phrase with human semantics based on suffixation. Here's a noun phrase with human semantics where definiteness comes into play. And then the two are combined because they exhibit the relation of apposition. And then shem, which is analyzed as construct, is used to form a noun phrase with abstract semantics, and that is done on the basis of the construct relation. That's the subject. And then down here we have the subject complement. Now, the edge does not go straight through to Yoel. There's this in the middle and in the midst, and we'll turn to that in a moment. Notice that the subject and the subject complement do not yet have semantic roles assigned to them. They both involve noun phrases, and so they should and will have semantic roles. It turns out we know the semantic role that we will assign. This will be assigned a semantic role of identified, and this will be assigned the semantic role of identification. Yoel is the identity, although there's more to be said about the identity, and that's where this other node comes in. Let's look at this second clause down here in isolation first. This consists in our analysis of a subject which has a similar sort of behavior, except that because of the way things are ordered, the noun phrase, we just have one noun phrase, which is involves quantity, and that is combined with the construct noun, shem, and that then produces a subject. Once again, we have not assigned semantic roles here. And then the subject complement, at least in part, consists of a bia. Now, the question then becomes, well, what do you do with shofatim b'Be'er-Sheva? And in our analysis, we ask, well, who are the judges in Beersheba? And the answer is not that Abia is the judges, nor is the answer that Yoel is the judges. The answer is that Yoel and Abia together are the judges. And that's why we have this relationship we call distributed apposition, which intrinsically entails discontinuity. See how that edge crosses over these others? There's no way around that. And then this edge here comes down. And so considered together, this is in apposition with the two of them. Okay. Now over here, you see what's been done is that whereas the handling in the first clause is quite analogous, except for this break that involves a distributed apposition, the second clause shows indicates an absent verb, and but in our case, that ellipsis we handle by saying that the verb for the second clause, it can be picked up here, and so we have this edge going up here. But notice then that this predicator has two mother nodes, this one and this one. Similarly, what do we do with this shofatim Be'er-Sheva? Well, this has been, the shofatim has been analyzed as a noun-verb participle, so that it behaves like a noun up front over here and behaves like a verb out back over here. See how it has an adjunct that goes with it. Now, what's been done here is this has been split off into an isolated structure, and it is indicated that the subject is missing and that the predicator is missing. Well, in fact, what we have done here is realize that this has a nominal. It's a nominalized phrase, and it is part of both of these clauses. And notice once again that multiple parentage is involved here. This node has two parents because these two things considered together equate to this thing, this constituent. So that's how those things work. Well, I believe we've reached the denouement point. Been through some fairly difficult stuff. Hope it's been intelligible. Let's conclude finally with a very brief touch on word attributes. I put word in quotes because to keep consistency with other databases, the accordance preference was to use the word word. Of course, our preference is to use the word segment. So the point is, though, of this slide, that several classifications have been made and applied to the segments as regards genre, speech transition, and textual source, especially Pentateuchal, where we follow Eisfeld. You can see what's going on by examining the categories associated with the word attribute search option in the accordance Andersen-Forbes module. Now, what I'd like to turn to, though, is just a little display that shows, it gives you a sort of a hint as to what is going on with these various classification attributes. This little table illustrates the markup of texts as regards speech level and genre. The codes that are shown here are not things that users should memorize or need to memorize, but are shorthand ways of indicating what's going on. What we show here is Jeremiah 27:1, verses 1 through 12, and we leave out some of the intermediate verses because we can make our case just by showing this. You see what happens starting in 27 verse 1, the genre is capital N. That code stands for author to reader narrative. So that carries on to here. And then we go into a bunch of embedded oracles and comments, such that whereas here the speech level was 0, sort of the ground, the baseline, by the time we get to verse 11, we're up to level 5. This represents level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the type glosses you will probably recognize. And then it switches into a sequence of further and further and further and further and further embedded speeches until the end of verse 11, where, as indicated by this little code, this says drop down 4 levels. And so after this is uttered, it drops down to level 1, and it goes from being oracular to being lowercase n, which is narrative within speech. We have a whole vast number of codes, and we have a certain number of levels, codes for levels that occur. Excuse me. These the markup as regards speech level it's being reviewed by Dr. Ulf Bergsman, and it's about to be concluded. He's about 80% of the way done. That has been very fruitful. The original codes were assigned, I think, probably 40 years ago, so it is well to go through at this stage and check them and update them, and that's what we are doing. Other review is going on and will continue. It's our intent to continue to improve the database, of course trying to catch errors, but also refining classification and improving consistency. And as strength and resources are granted, we hope and plan to extend things. We have a pretty well laid out plan for things that we want to add by way of extension. And obviously, discourse representation would be wonderful if we could achieve it. That is a very, very major task, however. So there you have it, Dean's Introduction to the Andersen-Forbes Database. I realize that it's involved some difficult concepts, many of them new. I hope I've been intelligible, and I hope I haven't gone through the material too rapidly. Over the past 50 years, my beloved wife, Ellen, has been admonishing me to slow down. I'm doing my best, my love. So that's it for now. If you found this useful, please let us know, and maybe we'll make some more of these things. As Frank would say, good on you. Bye-bye.